Good day, everyone. This is Anapi of the AS class under Professor Santa Rita of UP Diliman Asian Center. And I will be presenting to you my research on the emergence of suicide bombing in the Philippines. My research objectives is to identify the factors that triggered the emergence of this new terrorism tactic in the country and determine the suicide bombing trend in the Philippines. It also aims to look at the government response to address this emerging threat. Shown are my research questions. So before I proceed my discussion about suicide bombing, let us first have a quick review of the history of terrorism in the Philippines, specifically on the southern part of the country. When the Americans came in the Philippines in the 1900s, the Moros began experiencing marginalization because of the economic policies, land laws, and migration programs that were implemented in Mindanao. This experience motivated the Moros to mobilize against the Philippine government and call for independence by the end of 1960s, and this led to the formation of the Moro National Liberation Front. When the government had peace negotiations with the MNLF in the 1970s, it resulted to the creation of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. However, some members of the MNLF were not satisfied enough, and thus they created a splinter group, and that's the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in 1978. By 1991, another group was formed, which was the Abu Sayyaf group, or the ASG. This another splinter group of the MNLF became what is considered today one of the most radical and violent separatist group in the country. However, it's still being questioned whether they are really a separatist group or simply an extremist group. They were known for bombings, kidnappings, and beheadings of their hostages. This can be attributed to the links of ASG with Al-Qaeda and Jamaya Islamiyah. As early as its creation in the 1990s, they were actually receiving funding from Al-Qaeda during that time. The two splinter groups further led to the creation of smaller terrorist factions that are still active today, and most of the terrorist attacks that we are experiencing now are actually committed by these smaller groups. These are the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, the Maute Group or Daula Islamiyah, ASG, the Sulu faction, and the ASG Basilan faction. So given this history, we do know that the terrorism in southern Philippines is rooted on the separatist movement that began in the late 1960s, but for the past years, it has been evolving. And right now, with the establishment of the, I think most of the attacks nowadays are not 100% driven by separatism anymore. There is an element of terrorism already present. And these smaller groups or smaller factions now have links with the Islamic State, although they are not officially pronounced as a part of the Islamic State. Many of these groups, like the Maute group and the Sulu faction, as well as the Basilan faction of the ASG, are trying to get the recognition or to be part of the IS. Now, despite being relatively new groups, the four splinter groups from the MILF and the ASG were actually involved in a lot of attacks in the recent years. And one of the most infamous one was the Marawi Siege in 2017. Marawi Siege is considered as the longest urban battle that we experienced in the country. And this experience did change and influenced a lot of change, both on the side of the government forces as well on the side of the terrorist groups. Despite being smaller terrorist groups, these four splinter groups were actually involved in a lot of attacks in the recent years. And the most infamous one was the Marawi Siege in 2017, where the Maute group, led by the Maute brothers, joined forces with some members of the Abu Sayyaf group led by Isnilon Hapilon to siege the city and attempt to establish a caliphate. So the government forces were able to prevent this. However, this longest urban battle in the country turned Marawi into rubbles. The experience in Marawi Siege led to a lot of changes within the government forces, organizations, or the military, and also did influence how the terrorist groups are operating now. Um, According to TEMB in 2019, the Marawi Siege is actually a pivotal moment for the history of terrorism in the country, because after Marawi Siege, terrorist groups became more decentralized, and they tend to now work in smaller cells. It was also later on followed by the use of suicide bombing tactic to intimidate the government. The first attempt to conduct a suicide bombing in the Philippines was actually done in 2018. There are different perspectives on really what is the first suicide attack that transpired in the country. There are some scholars that say that the first attack that we considered would be the Lamitan City bombing on July 31, 2018. It took the lives of 10 people. But the AFP, PNP, and as well as other scholars believe that that is not the case, since the bomb was actually remotely detonated at a military checkpoint. It was a seemingly last-ditch effort, since the government were able to intercept their movement, so they had to prematurely detonate the bomb. So the suicide bombing attack wasn't successful at the end of the day. But um, in a report published by the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research, Lamitan bombing was considered as an event that had a transformative effect to the Philippine terrorism landscape, and also the possible rise of suicide bombing as a tactic against the government forces. As seen on January 27, 2019, a much more deliberate suicide attack was committed by an Indonesian couple that killed 22 people at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Cathedral in Holosulu. On June 28, 2019, 8 people were killed and 22 others were wounded in a military camp in Indanan, Sulu, when it was attacked by militants carrying improvised explosive devices. The 2 militants carrying the bombs were killed. This could be considered as another case of suicide bombing. However, the military dismisses this claim and said that the militants were planning to plant IEDs inside the camp, and their plan was foiled by the government forces. Given those events in the past, let us now look on the factors that trigger suicide bombing in the Philippines. The main factors that triggered suicide bombing attacks in the Philippines are: one, the desire of the ASG to be recognized by ISIS. It is seen that the suicide attacks transpired after the Marawi Siege, and the ASG remained to have the need for recognition from ISIS, and they tried to achieve it by showing the world that they've already embraced the ISIS ideology, which is shown through extremism in this case. We consider the second factor that triggered suicide bombing is linked with the first one, which is that foreign terror networks continue to try to keep their influence broader and spread terror in our region. And thus they are working to get suicide bombing in the Philippine territory. If we look at the trend, this could still be a sign of the growing ISIS influence in the country, with the foreign suicide bombers from countries like Egypt, Germany, and Morocco. These are the same nationalities that were reportedly present during the Marawi Siege. Lastly, the ASG need a new tactic to intimidate the government. After the Marawi Siege, more government forces were redeployed in Mindanao. When you look at the data, 50% of all the suicide attacks were done as attacks against military camps. So this was how they reacted when more government forces were deployed in Mindanao. There was even a new infantry division that was established in Mindanao after the Marawi Siege, as well as the deployment of the Brigade Combat Team of the Philippine Army. Those events somehow triggered this kind of response from the AS. So there have been 4 recorded suicide attacks perpetrated by both foreign and local bombers. This resulted to the death of about 46 people, including civilians and government forces. Both in 2019 and 2020, the country have recorded a devastating attacks in areas, devastating attacks in Holosulu. The attacks were done in areas where civilians commonly gather, such as a church and at the town center. The first one, as mentioned earlier, was the January 2017 cathedral bombing in Hulosulu that claimed 23 lives. On August 24, 2020, Sulu was once again faced with a huge bombing that killed 15 people when it exploded in a crowded area near the town plaza of Hulo, followed by another explosion near the Cathedral of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. In this event, though, the first bomb was detonated remotely. The bomb was planted on a motorcycle parked near the crowded area, but the suicide bomber committed the suicide bombing near the Cathedral of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Report says that she would have wanted to detonate it again to cause more injuries to people inside or maybe at the entrance of the Our Lady of Mount Carmel. However, the government forces were able to prevent the suicide bomber from entering the area. Fortunately, no more attacks has been recorded in the country, but this does not mean the end of suicide bombing here. During the attack on January 2019, it was a couple, an Indonesian couple, who perpetrated the attack. While for the attack on the August 2022, the suicide bomber was now a Filipino and she's female. For the attacks on the 28 June 2019 and the 8 September 2019, most of them were done by foreigners. However, there's still one male suicide bomber who tried to enter the military camp on June 20, 2019. Government forces has been trying to prevent attacks like this from happening. In 2019, soldiers intercepted 3 suspected suicide bombers in Indanan, Sulu, and the armed forces of the Philippines Western Mindanao Command reported that the suspects were on their way to Metro Holo to carry out another suicide attack. During that encounter, all the 3 suspected suicide bombers were actually killed. So there were, after the attack in 2020, in August 2020, there were no more suicide bombing attacks that were successfully done in Hulosulu. However, both in 2020 and 2021, there were about 12 female suspects arrested by the government forces. These women were arrested because they have reportedly undergone training on suicide bombing and were even assembling explosives in their homes. So given all those events in the past, you can say that with the success of suicide attacks in 2019 and 2020, we could see a growing confidence from the ASG on their ability to conduct this tactic. However, there is yet to have a concrete evidence based on an actual events reported in the public to show that it has been locally embraced. Recent attack and arrests of alleged suicide bombers also show that the culture is not the likely trigger for locals to adopt suicide bombing. Embracing suicide bombing is not really aligned with the local culture or the practices of the ethnic groups like the Tausugs. Suicide bombing is not culturally accepted. So this is not likely the trigger for locals to adopt suicide bombing. But instead, the reports from other researchers I've read show that it is radicalization based on kinship that makes people perpetrate suicide bombing. So we've seen that it is widows and children of previously killed suicide bombers who were among the suspected trained Filipino female suicide bombers arrested in Sulu in 2020 and 2021. With the twin bombing in Sulu in 2019, involving a woman suicide bomber, as well as the arrest of alleged suicide bombers. It highlights also the involvement of women in terrorism today. It shows how ASG is really adapting to the ways of ISIS. In an analysis by Lowly Institute in 2019, it was said that the Islamic State considers the support of women as a key to their survival. So let me quote Khalil in 2019. Greater female participation in jihad have a profound influence on the jihadist threat and counterterrorism efforts. It was further cited in the report that 56% of the 431st suicide bomber deployed in Boko Haram in Africa in 2011 to 2017 were women. And Boko Haram is an ISIS affiliate since 2015. With these trends aligning with that of our experience in the Philippines, the role of women on suicide bombing is likely to be huge if suicide bombing is solidified as a terrorist tactic being used in the country. So the last trend is that despite having no suicide bombing attacks in the Philippines in 2021, the ASG continued to recruit and train suicide bombers as evident in the arrest of this 13 alleged suicide bomber in that year. Even there were reports that Sawadjan was actually injured in an encounter with the government, and there are reports that he died later on. So we can say, if that is true, that might have an influence on why there was no suicide bombing attack conducted in 2021, since the main leader of the faction that has been promoting this kind of terrorist act was killed. However, his death, does not give us an assurance that suicide bombing will no longer be used by ASG in the following years. We expect that he will just be replaced by another leader, probably with the same interest and the same vision, let's say, for the ASG. So given these trends, let us now look at the government response. So the government, as we have seen with the number of attacks foiled, as well as the arrests done to prevent suicide attacks, the government forces has been working on preventing suicide bombing attacks through intercepting possible attacks, as well as finding personalities that are being groomed to becoming suicide bombers. As I said earlier, in 2020, there were reports that Hajan Sawajan died after getting injured in an encounter with the government. So yun. As the leader of the ASG faction that has been executing the suicide bombings in Sulu, his demise could be one of the factors why there were no more attacks in 2021. So that's, I think we can consider that as a win for the government forces. However, as I said earlier, this doesn't assure us that on the following months or years, we will not be experiencing the same level of threat. Aside from the work of the government forces, the government also launched its National Action Plan for Women, Peace,